Hey everybody. So got a special guest this week. Give you guys some backstory. So James Ryan is a good friend of mine going way back.
Yeah,
Years. What year did we meet?
I met you in 2001, maybe
Wow.
2000. I mark my date as April 6, 2001.
It was probably 2001. Yeah.
Yeah.
And anyway, when I say backstory, he was around for the very beginning of what, in my opinion, what is eventually morphed into resistance recovery, at least from where I'm sitting.
Hmm.
And so he's got a lot of, he's a great researcher, a great writer, and he's got quite a tale to tell. I've often asked if he could interview me as well, so there may be a little bit of that. So anyway, let's start.
You want to start with origin stuff or
I
what?
want to start with just James Ryan saying who James Ryan is.
Oh, so I'm James Ryan. I'm an addict in recovery. My sobriety date is April 6, 2001. I'm currently a PhD candidate at University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I'm studying in a field called composition and rhetoric, which is like a too fancy term for people who want to be writing teachers, mostly. And I've written my dissertation on recovery writing. So I've interviewed people in recovery about the kinds of writing that they do that they consider to be part of their recovery program, and sort of talked to them about like, what kinds of writing did you do? What was your experience with that kind of writing? What happened as a result? Those were kind of the primary questions, which turned up all kinds of interesting things from a recovery perspective, and some interesting things from an academic perspective, which is always, writing this thing has felt really like a split consciousness in a weird way. Like on one hand, I'm having to make this useful to some niche academic conversation. And on the other hand, I'm like, all this stuff is already super interesting and useful from a recovery perspective. So there's like those two pieces to that research that are kind of sometimes in conflict.
Well, it'll be interesting to see who reads it and the response, because one thing that you can do is we can give you a platform.
Okay.
So, we got 1,300 people now, and I'm sure it'll be bigger soon. And then we can just put it out there. We could even do a Zoom meeting just about the dissertation.
Dissertation, sure.
Yeah.
That'd be cool. It's going to be a bunch of academic jargon and then plus recovery stories. So and by academic jargon, it's like, how is recovery writing useful to scholars of writing generally? Is kind of like, that's the angle of the dissertation. If it gets rewritten someday into like a recovery book, it'll look really different. Like, how do we write and why do we do it?
Well, we can give a disclaimer of ignore pages.
Right. Unless you really want to get into the gobbledygook, skip to chapter 2. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we owe our audience a little background, because from where I sit, your story's got some extremely dramatic and unconventional aspects to it.
Okay.
So maybe just give us the picture of, just give it to us. Starting with, son of a minister and the drugs and where you wound up. And
okay. Like back to family roots and stuff like that.
3 generations, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Great-grandpa James Ryan coming over and from Ireland, right? Yeah. So I grew up in like a suburban, white, middle-class family. Dad was a minister, mom was a therapist. That's that background. Never drank or got high or anything until after I dropped out of high school my senior year. And when I did, it sort of like lit up parts of me that I didn't know could be lit up. In terms of like feeling good, obviously, but also like these realms of the brain that I didn't know I could experience, which proved to be both interesting and dangerous. Within about a year of smoking weed and dropping acid, I was, in the nut house. I was institutionalized. And in California, they call it 5150, where like the state determines that you're unsafe to yourself and others, and you need to go into an institution. You want like details of that? You want like weird stories? Probably you want weird stories.
I mean, I think a little color is always good.
So typical like Friday afternoon for me was like I'd been up all night, and I'm walking through the suburbs of LA, and I'm just hearing all the voices. I'm hearing every voice of every person in every house that I pass, and they all think I'm an asshole. Like it house for house, everyone's like, this fucking guy, why is he here in our neighborhood? I'm gonna let my dogs out and they'll chew them up, and like just all this stuff from every single house. So I just you got to keep walking to stay ahead of the wave of hate that follows you, and so it was house after house of this like animosity and like ill will, and I'm just trying to keep ahead of it and block it out as best I can. And then I come across upon this lady who's out front just watering her front yard with a hose. This old lady in like I don't know, nightgown and the hair and one of those net things, and she's watering and she's smoking a cigarette. And when I get to her, she says, I heard you coming, so I had a glass of whiskey and came outside to see for myself. I didn't know what to say to that. She was like saying the quiet part out loud. You're not supposed to tell people you can hear their voice in your brain. You're not supposed to I'm not supposed to talk about those things. People think I'm crazy, right? And so here she is just telling it to me. And it kind of like blew my brain back a little bit. And I didn't know what to say, so I just didn't say anything and kept walking. So it was like, obviously not very functional guy, having some weird experiences that were fun at first, but got to this point where I can't shut them off, and that kind of stuff is happening, right? Go to the nut house, and I'm convinced.
Did you at the time say this is because of LSD and weed?
No, it was a government experiment, is what it was. And they were trying to see, like I had unlocked something, obviously, with my, chemicals, but now I had it, and they were trying to poke at me in different ways in order to see what sort of powers would come out if I would explode. They didn't care what happened. They were just curious, right? And so certain cars would pass. You could actually like see in patterns of traffic, the colors of cars were, coded messages. So I could like read like, black car, white car, black car, gray car, red car meant a thing. I don't remember what the code was. I wish I did. But it was that kind of, was what I was thinking, was like, people are out to get me. The government is pushing. There seemed to be two separate factions that were kind of, the black car people and the white car people, and they wanted to push it in different directions, but we're just curious to see what could come of a superpowered guy like me.
Have you ever looked at John Weir Perry, Trials of Visionary Mind?
No.
So he's a Jungian, worked with, it wasn't drug stuff, he worked with first onset psychosis.
Okay.
It couldn't be people that had already been institutionalized and such. Mm-hmm. And no medications, and he did it in a residential setting. It was basically a house, a ton of art supplies, no pathologization of the client. You were not to contradict the delusions, none of that.
Right.
And he kept really good records, and he got state funding. It was in California, late 60s. And it's a fascinating thing, because what he did tracking their artwork and their delusions is because of the Jungian training, he was able to show all the powerful archetypal, off the charts. And he gets into it, the king and the two sides, and it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
But what he said this very interesting thing. He said most of his clients, there was a natural progression. He used that term of their psychosis that was 6 weeks long, which is interesting, 6 weeks.
Right.
And he said most of them, the overwhelming majority of them, post-morbid functioned at a much higher level than pre-morbid.
Okay.
They were more just together, more agents in their own lives, kind of thing. And then he said it all would change when they had one little insight into the paranoia or the delusions actually being a projection of an internal drama.
Right.
He said the second they had that insight, it was enough, and then healing just was whoosh right after.
Wow. I could see that. So it's like a 6 week window, and then gain that insight, and then.
Well, they get it somewhere in the 6 weeks, and then they.
Yeah. Right. Wow. That's cool. Because it is very much like what I was experiencing was very much like an interpretive scramble. Like I was getting all these stimuli and was just reading it through this very like self-centered narrative of like, I am the most powerful being in the world and everybody pays attention to me.
Right. The whole messianic thing, yeah.
Right.
And yet, to this day, do you still think there was a certain veracity in some of what you experienced?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to account for that lady on the lawn saying that shit. It's either she didn't say it or she wasn't there, but I saw it, but it felt like she was there. Like, I can't. It's such a real experience that it's hard to just dismiss as like crazy, right?
And subsequently, have you been troubled by that side of it? That there was some part of it that spoke to some other reality? Or is that something you try not to think about?
No, at times I've been troubled by it. I would say I'm in a better place with it now than I've ever been. The risk is like, the fear is like, I don't want to break that seal again. I don't want to be that guy walking down the neighborhood, everybody's trying to sick dogs on him. I don't want to be that guy. No. So the fear has always been, well, if I do certain spiritual things, or if I, follow this road too much or give it too much credibility, then, maybe there's a slippery slope there. That's been the nervousness. And I think for a while, then maybe that was even true. But more recently, I've felt more stable. Like I couldn't even do Oxford Group has this thing called two-way prayer, where you sit down and you get quiet for a minute and you sort of pray like, God, what do you want me to be doing today? And you sort of listen for insight and write down whatever comes. That felt way too risky to me to do that kind of work, because it's like, I've heard voices and followed them around town. I got into weird situations because I'd done that. So the idea that I'm going to purposefully put myself into a place to hear voices felt very scary to me. And maybe it's been in the last 8 to 10 years where that stuff started to feel safe and grounded to me instead. I'm not exactly sure what the shift was. Maybe it's just time. Or a different phase of life or something.
Well, we'll probably be able to circle back to that. Okay, so you wind up institutionalized and medicated, and
then they let me out, and they say you're a good responder to medication. And I talked to my parents, I switched doctors, new doctor, I say different symptoms, come out with different meds, things get a little worse. This time parents figure out it's not just schizophrenia, it's drug addiction, so they send me off to rehab. After that, I go to this wilderness program for 1.5 years or something. And then I'm kind of lost and drift in the world. I mean, I don't every detail of the life between now and then, but I sort of enter this period of like kind of in recovery, but all screwed up, right?
Right. I don't know, where did this happen? When we talked about, I carefully tracked, in light of dislocation theory,
Uh-huh.
how you'd get relatively integrated in the
Okay, sure.
program,
Yep.
and then you'd become pretty much asymptomatic, take
Right.
yourself off your meds,
Yeah.
and then as your external world got tenuous, girls and young man in the world not knowing what to do kind of thing,
Yeah.
things would come back. Am I remembering this right?
Yeah, yeah, more or less. So like inside a like treatment environment, things are like super contained and orderly, and like there's a structure, right? When I was
Friendship, people.
Yeah, right. People are being personal. I was still pretty fragile in my first 30-day treatment. But by the end of it, I was like, oh, okay, those voices were because I was getting high, and they're getting quieter now. And I should probably stay sober. Um, Year-long, like independent youth at risk wilderness thing, independent living skills program. Much more grounded as I went through that. Very much a part of that community. Very much integrated into that community and felt like meaningful relationships and stuff. And yeah, was more or less asymptomatic there. Didn't ever really consider to like using or drinking. And when other people were about to graduate and they told me that they were, that was sort of like, what? That was weird for me.
Just for clarity, when you say asymptomatic, we're talking both psychosis and
Oh yeah, yeah, right.
what we
Makes
would
sense.
call obsession to you.
Yes, 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 yes. Um, yeah, I did have this weird experience with my girlfriend at the time, where she had some kind of history with psychic experiences, and was sort of asking me about what it was like when I was crazy and blah blah blah. And she kind of touched me, and I felt that whole feeling of like everyone in LA can hear your thoughts. It kind of like this weird darkness spiraling out, and she like jumped back.
She
Was like,
literally touched you.
yeah, and then literally jumped back and was like, I don't ever want you to do that again. Like, don't bring that out anymore. um, so it's not, it was still there, right? And it still felt dangerous. But in the context of that community, I didn't really have weird ideas. Well, I had weird ideas, but I didn't have like the kind of weird ideas where like ladies watering the lawn, reading your mind kind of ideas. Um, and yeah, I felt integrated there. Once I graduated, though, didn't have any community at all, became really, really depressed and isolated and alienated, and started getting into weirder thoughts. And then I would sort of I'd move, and I would find some new community, try to become integrated there. When that fell apart, I would fall apart, and then I would just keep hopping around.
And when you say that you fall apart, how bad would it get?
The worst that it got was in Farmington, Maine, just before I met you in the chapter 2 group. And that was like living in a small apartment. All of the walls are covered with plastic sheets with weird writing on them. Hearing scratching on the walls at night, and then like drawing little crosses to make that scratching go away, and it would work, right? I would hear like, and then draw the cross, and the only way to sleep. So I had all these crosses all over the wall, and all this weird shit all over the walls. And just like, not knowing anybody, totally disconnected, all up in my head, thinking I'm the next William Burroughs. But also super, super depressed. And I don't want to get high because I know where that takes me. And I don't want to be sober because it's just as bad.
And you're not medicated.
Not medicated, no. Went to go see a talk doctor, a psychologist at that point, and sort of self-analyzed myself for him. And he's like, oh, you're very insightful. I was like, well, gave up on that. Yeah, so just in a bad spot, and I could tell that like not only was it a possibility of descending back into that stuff, but it was happening, right? With the scratching and the feeling of being called down the hallway, and like that whole sort of sense was coming back. And I knew that if that continued, then I didn't have a way to stop it, right? And that's more or less when I met you.
Yeah. So at that time, I'm 7 years clean, 6 years into the steps.
Right.
And, you know, pretty much a zealot / reformer, which I would be for a while. Virtually no success. Was Tom before or after you?
Tom's before me.
So almost no success sponsoring people, and not for lack of trying.
Uh-huh.
So the audience should know that, you know, when I got sober in 95, you couldn't find this sort of weird big book world that we see everywhere now, where people take steps out of the book. You saw some lip service to the book. You saw some things called AWOLs, but it was really heavy meeting attendance. And I did not do well with that. And so I met the late, great Don Pritz, and things changed. But by the time James comes around, doing 12 steps out of the big book was this sort of edgy thing with a small community. Kind of in Maine, there seemed to be two communities, one in Farmington and one in Camden. And we were swimming upstream, and we were encountering a lot of adversity. But we were tight, we were coherent. Today, I would say we were definitely confusing the map for the territory. And I would love to get your opinion on that in a little bit. But.
Sure.
So anyway, this is when James comes into my life, and it was my wife who was working at a sexual violence emergency services place in part on the emergency phone thing.
Yeah, it's a crisis hotline for.
Crisis hotline was one of the things they did, and James was manning the hotline, and that's how she met him, and he met me. And at the time, you were already going to NA?
Yep, that's right. Yeah, there was a small NA meeting there that was just like any other NA meeting I've ever been to, where it was kind of rough around the edges and people were all really miserable like I was, and I fit in just fine. Me with my weird ideation and like feeling like I might fall into psychosis any minute, I was like right in there, right? Yeah. So let's say this though. When you say that the meeting was edgy, it was edgy for a couple reasons. One was you covered, which is like the big book thing, right? Not a lot of people working steps, and you know, at that meeting, people were definitely saying that everybody should, right? Like this is the way to recover, and fair enough. But there was another reason too, I think, which was y'all had Wanda get better, who was an Al-Anon, and she would chair the meeting sometimes, and would and that was kind of too radical for some people. The idea that there could be addicts and alcoholics and Al-Anons kind of all recovering from the same stuff and all sharing in the same meeting felt like it was breaking AA in some way. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of our friends in the big book world, well, including Don Pritz, simply just said, well, we're not an AA meeting.
Right.
And we were fine with that. We were defiant.
Right.
You know, we didn't read the usual stuff. We found our own stuff, drew it up. We didn't do chips. We prayed differently. We didn't do birthday anniversary cakes. We did pizza You know, so we tried to shake it up in case somebody walked in there, they would be like, what the hell is this?
Right.
Which we succeeded. I, you know, a lot of times what we just succeeded in doing is driving people away.
Right.
You know, it wasn't necessarily attractive.
Right. But it was striking.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, this is different than what I expected. Right.
Yeah.
And if that sometimes that pisses people off and they walk away. And sometimes, like for me, it was like, whoa, and you start paying attention.
Mm.
Right. And then that's an opportunity to start hearing things that you never heard before, which for me was like people identifying exactly what was going on in my head in their own story. Like you talking about what it's like to be sober without a solution felt like what I was living. And then I could see that you weren't living that anymore. Right. And that was super compelling, I thought.
But there was huge dissonance for you right coming in because of your upbringing and the,
Well,
and
yeah.
the psychedelics combined, right?
Well, the God thing was the big slap in the face. There was sort of this identification of like, I'm suffering exactly what they've suffered and they're better. And then you all would say like, God is the answer. There we go. You know, and then it was hard to hear anything else after that, right? It was just sort of like, oh, fuck, God people. But the first part was so compelling that I would come back for more. And, you know, the next week it would be the same thing, like, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then the God stuff would hit me again, right? It's like this weird yo-yo effect of like, it's so good. No, I can't do it. But yeah, so my upbringing, you know, I grew up in a fairly conservative, almost fundamentalist sort of evangelical environment, and you know, bailed out of that before I dropped out of high school, before I got high, and was really, really conflicted about anybody that said God or about anything to do with that. It felt like I was supposed to, I know a lot of people have this experience. They got a bad upbringing with religion, or bad taste for it or whatever. And then when we come to recovery and it's spiritual, then that's a problem, because we feel like you're asking me to go back to that thing that I don't like, back to that thing we identify it as the same thing. Like if you're saying God and they said God, then you must mean the same thing. So actually, the psychedelics actually, I think, helped me get through that barrier, because the big book said things like, rocketed into a fourth dimension of existence. I was like, okay, I've seen that. All right. Maybe they didn't say that in church, so like maybe this is more my speed, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
And you were into some weird shit then too.
Well,
right?
I still am.
Yeah. Right.
That's not good.
You were reading a lot of Gurdjieff at the time, I think.
Yeah. Gurdjieff, Steiner.
Yeah. I remember we fed you too much coffee one night and you explained the whole thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Right. So there's the meeting. There we are. What do you want to know? Where should we go from there?
Well, I think some of the drama around the third step would be good.
Okay. Yeah. So you sort of at some point said that you would help me through the steps. You sort of invited me to be your sponsee, and I took you up on that. And I think steps 1 and 2 were pretty quick. You sort of, you know, you're like, you've been reading the big book, you kind of know what it is. You took me through a few things and I sort of nodded along. But then as I remember it, there was sort of an assignment to like think about the third step for a week. And then we would get together and go out in the woods and pray, something weird like that, right? And so that week was a very conflicted week for me, where it was, I want this, I want to feel better, I want to change, I want to feel like those guys feel, I don't want anything to do with religion or God, what am I supposed to do? And that sort of, you know, ping pong in my brain was going on all week. At some point, my memory of this moment is like, changed over time, or it has details that can't possibly be true because I remember it snowing and it's not winter.
Yeah.
Like there's like a lot of weird details to it, but I do remember walking to the campus library in some kind of weather, and it got something in me switched from this like tense, like wrestling place to like an open listening place. And I just heard the words over and over again, thy will be done, thy will be done, thy will be done, thy will be done. It was like repeating itself for me. And my first reaction was one of resistance, like it's another invasive thought, right? Like another voice that I don't want to hear anything from. Because in my past, thy will be done has always meant God tells you what to do and you better fucking do it because you suck, right? Which is still pretty much true. But that was the I sort of reacted against that kind of attitude with that sort of phrase. But then I was sort of had this, I guess you call it a vision. I saw kind of the timeline of my life spread out before me. And it was, you know, high or not high, before drugs, after drugs, whatever. My life was a series of like, you know, unfortunate events that ended up in these points of decision. And at those points, I would always pick the most selfish thing. Like the only program I had in my head was, you know, evaluate the situation for whatever benefits me most and pick that. And then the result was always that I was more alone and more alienated and more restless than before. And then my life would go on that level. And then I would hit another point of decision and the same program would run. What's going to suit me best? What do I like best? What's going to feel good? I would pick that result and I would go that way. And then the same, you know, I would be more alienated, more depressed, blah, blah, blah. So it was a sort of like graduated downward slope of like selfishness and despair. And I realized that was my will running my life, right? That's all that I've got is I don't have another program in me. I don't have a way to evaluate situations that isn't that. I will always pick the selfish thing. I will always become more alienated. And the end of that route is not too far away. It's not looking really good. So the idea that there could be some other will in the universe that was other than that and that would willingly intervene in those situations was like, oh shit, what a gift, what a blessing, right? To be like hit a point of decision. Here comes the old hamster running its wheel, and then something else could come in and take your life in a different direction that I can't do. All of a sudden that term had like a really different meaning for me, and it really hit me as like, fuck, I don't have to die. I don't have to be this way anymore. I don't have to be this kind of human. I can let this thing in and do anything else, which would be better than where I'm at. And I was like crying, and I walk in the library and it's like snot coming out my nose, and I lock myself in the bathroom and then just get on my knees. And I can't remember the prayer as you showed it to me, but I'd say something stupid like, well, not stupid, but something really, really simple and clear. It was just like, I don't know what to do. Help me. Right. And I didn't see angels, but I just felt clean in a way that I hadn't felt, I don't think ever. Clean and connected in a way that I had never felt before.
So in your mind, that was your third step in the bathroom.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know that I told you that at the time, because you were like, hey, we're going to go take your third step. And we went out in the woods and said a prayer, and you're like looking at me like, did anything happen? I do.
It's so interesting. I don't know if this is time to do it, but unpack why you didn't tell me. And yet here's this strange parallel between us, which, you know, is not common in my experience, which is this thing really took off at the third step.
Yeah. Right.
I got, you know, hell, my third step might have been the most powerful thing I did in all of the steps.
Why don't we do this? Why don't you tell me what yours was like? I don't know that I've heard.
Mine was, I was just, I went down to New York to meet Don.
Yeah.
And I was mesmerized pretty much. You gotta understand, I had never read the first part of the book. I owned a big book and I had only read, 3 stories or something. And so, his presentation and who he was, blah, 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 it just mesmerized me. Mm-hmm. And then when we took a third step, it wasn't an intense emotional thing, but it was just, my mind was just so quiet and peaceful. And that sort of, I would even say this, I would say that a certain base level calmness settled into me.
Yeah. That
really, and I've been through hell numerous times since then, it's never really left. So that's what I come back to Farmington with, like this sense of just there's something solid here.
Right.
And I can build on that,
Right.
And in fact, it's just my nature probably anyway. I'm just not a rule follower and I'm not a team, I'm not whatever. I don't join well.
Yeah.
Suddenly I had a conviction of my own.
Right.
Yeah. And so I did not feel dependent on human advice and support anymore.
Right.
Not that I don't mean to diminish that, but I mean, obviously I need that to be happy and have a meaningful life, but I didn't feel that was what was it was this thing I had inside of me now.
Right.
Yeah.
I think the feeling piece, that like affective feeling piece of that is maybe stronger than we think. Because like at least the way Mike Bro tells that your restlessness was pretty epic prior to your third step. Like just like barely hanging on, huh?
Oh yeah, and running around all the time. Mm-hmm. The gym and the meetings and the cigarettes and the food and just
right. Yeah. So suddenly be grounded in like inner peace is like pretty radical, even if it's not like showy, right? It's not like flashing.
Yeah, and it's not like peace like we think of it now either. It's not this. Mm-hmm. It's not the yoga journal. It's not. I don't know how to put it. It's this integrated state kind of. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's the hardest thing. I feel like the third step and surrender are the hardest things to explain to anybody.
I couldn't agree more.
You can run around in circles all day. So I tell a story about that. This is working in professional treatment and, taking a cohort through up to a third step, talking to them about what it means, what it is. And somehow someone in the room gets it on a really deep level. And he's like, you mean I don't have to try to be this person anymore? I don't have to prove anything anymore? I can just let go of all that and just be? And I was like, exactly. And he just bawls his eyes out and he's screaming and hollering and crying and just like, it's so good. He's having it, right? He's having it right there. Like he just let go of the whole thing, the whole like weird, knotted, twisted up human that he was just went whoosh. came out in tears. And then someone, I forget what she said, but it was someone else in the group was looking at this like, what the fuck? And she was like, but do we really have to be willing to do anything?
Hey.
Like, whoop, like the thing was right in front of her face and she couldn't see it for what it was, right? Mm. So if that can happen, like I have no chance of explaining to you what a third step is. You can see it and you can't get it. Like, this is like some Gospel of John level misunderstanding.
Oh, it is. I mean, it is. It is like, and so institutionalizing it or getting prescriptive about it or whatever is a fool's errand. And yet, even if it's just you taking a sponsee through it, you're still there.
Yes.
You're not going to get out of the fool's errand.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I've seen people try to set that up by like putting pressure on someone's life. Like, well, you will know that you've done it if you'll agree to X or Y or Z,
Yeah,
which is something that you don't want to do. Right.
no.
And then it just, I don't know, it just is not the thing.
No. Well, sometimes it's just so obvious and ugly.
Right.
You've surrendered if you go to our sober living house.
Right. Right. It becomes really monetized and like, yeah.
It's horrible.
Right. Because what you get there is like a kind of compliance. Harry Tebow talks about this. You get compliance.
Yeah.
Which is in like the worst enemy of surrender. Because you think you've agreed to do a thing, but really you haven't let go of anything at all.
No.
You haven't had what that guy had in that room, that sort of crying your way into peace. And then I don't care where that guy goes to sober living. Or if he even goes, right? Like you tell me what God wants you to do at that point.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. But and what seems interesting is there's something in that kind of thing, surrender, is that the exterior and the interior, they don't have to be at odds anymore.
Right.
I'm not being somebody for you to like.
Yeah.
Well, I hate myself.
All right.
I don't have to do that anymore.
Right. Yeah.
If anything, I think that whole kind of thing has just gotten worse in society, in the digital age. I think that's another thing that we should be mindful of is I came up, a lot of people are saying this era starts in 95 with the popularity of the internet. So actually I got clean in what year? 94?
I don't know. I was 2001. You said you were 7 years at that time. So that gives you 94 is the math. Is that true? That's when I dropped out of high school.
Yeah, I guess it is 94.
Wow.
God, I can't believe I'm unclear about that. At any rate, so you and I, we're coming from a different time. Like, you're in the internet era, but we're still Gutenberg people.
Sure.
So for us, mucking around in a book again and again and again and again, we were kind of built like that already.
Right.
Whereas I think a lot of these folks, books are foreign, especially strangely written books from 1939.
Yeah.
So if I recall correctly, you enjoyed writing a fourth step because you like to write.
Yep. That sort of fit my way of being. Right. Yeah.
And you got relief, but I mean, basically, it seems like pretty quickly you became asymptomatic of all that stuff that was going on in the apartment, and it never came back.
That's right. That's right.
And did the fear of it coming back stay with you for a long time?
There was after 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, I entered this phase of like nothing I've experienced ever before. Maybe it goes a month, maybe 2, I don't know. But there's like, I could not cop a resentment if I tried. I couldn't be afraid of anything if I tried. I couldn't want anything. It was like, I had also sort of given up writing. Like other than my 4th step, after 4th step, I was like, before this, I was like, I'm going to school for creative writing. I'm going to be a creative writer. I'm going to be William Burroughs. I'm going to be this weird, eclectic guy, some literary genius, and like that all got unraveled in step 4, and was like, I'm not going to write anymore. I don't know what I'm going to do in the fall when I have to take a creative writing class, but I'm done. And was just in this state of acceptance that like wouldn't be unbroken. There was one time where I was like slipping out of it for a second and worrying about myself, and this bumblebee flew into my forehead. Bonk. Yeah, I was like, oh, that's right. I'm right here. So I wasn't worried about anything for a minute, right?
Well, 2 months is a while.
Yeah.
Quite a state of being to be in for months.
Yeah, right.
And here again, we're the same. I could say from my third step for 8 months, I don't think I had a bad day for 8 months.
Right. It's just like, here's the sunshine again and the birds in the morning and a cup of coffee. What? Like, I got no complaints.
Yeah.
Right. So I wouldn't say I was afraid of that stuff coming back in, but once that glow or whatever started to fade and I got into the, everyday life and thinking about what I got to do for homework and what the job needs and does this girl like me and that kind of stuff, that sort of routine, then then I was also like researching different spiritual practices and stuff, and there were some that I thought were kind of off limits to me because I didn't want to crack the egg again. Finding out, Bill and everybody's doing acid, and I was like, oh no. Right? But I mean, Bill Wilson in the gang. There were things like that where I didn't necessarily want radically transformative experiences that would like mess with my brain. I just wanted to be in that space again, that feeling of acceptance. And when I was astray from it or I was tightened up in something, I wanted to let go again. Right? So that was kind of where I was at that point.
Do you ever feel forlorn for that feeling?
Yeah. I thought I did something wrong. I thought I ruined it. When it sort of faded, I thought what did I do? Why are you taking this from me? Right? I got really like complex and like victim-y about it, and also like, oh, I did something wrong, like guilty.
Yeah.
Like, which only made it worse, right? You're only further from the feeling when you're doing all that. And I remember talking to Mike Bro about it, and he said, oh no, everybody goes through ups and downs, dry periods and high periods or whatever.
Yeah, but if you're like me, it's never come back.
Not like that.
No.
There'll be moments where like I'm really got my ego tight up around something, and then I go, oh, I'm not in control of that, and there's that moment of like, oh, thank God, right? But or there'll be moments like I did centering prayer for many years, and there'll be moments of like feeling like I've been able to let go of quite a bit of things in that space of 20 minutes, if I don't take a nap.
But if you're like me, it's still not the
It's not the thing, dude. It's not.
And I had a taste of something really comparable back in my using. I read this book called Meditations on the Tarot, and I got really, really high off that book and had all these spiritual experiences and became a nice person, really. And then I lost it. And then I had that period of time writing the steps again. And it's taken me years to come to some sort of terms with it that's just a tremendous gift.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you're not meant to live the rest of your days like that.
Right.
And I don't want to diminish the other spiritual things that have happened to me. Right. I'm appreciative of all these different flavors of things. Mm-hmm. But man, and you know what? If you haven't had it, you probably don't believe it. What's funny about resistance recovery now is I want to be open to people for whom that's never happened, may never happen, never.
Right.
And I think there are reasons for all that, and it's not their fault. Mm-hmm. But it makes you feel kind of, it actually has a little seed of alienation in it. Because other people, if they haven't felt that, they don't understand it.
Yeah. You can never explain it to somebody.
Not really.
And if you talk about it, you sound like a nut.
Yeah. And you're kind of looking for people to have it too.
Yeah, you want to spread it around.
Yeah. Wild thing.
That is interesting. So I think, I don't know, things that helped me with that were, I read some Oxford Group book. Oxford Group, I don't know if I should say this, but they're the people that came before AA. Bill and everybody sort of comes out of the Oxford Group to start 12 steps. And I started researching that and looking into that early on as like, where did this experience come from? How did we get it, right? So there was some Oxford Group sermon that was like, I forget the verse or even what gospel it's in, but there's a transfiguration and they see Jesus standing next to the prophets or whatever. And then they're like, the disciples are like, we want to set up camp here and live here. And the answer is, no, you can't live here. That's really the metaphor. I was like, okay, that is literally the metaphor for this, right? If I think can be literally a metaphor. But it was like, I am in this thing. I want to live here forever. And it's like, no, dude, you can have that, but you gotta move on and live a life, right?
It almost feels like a near-death experience in that sense, or a parallel to one. They don't want to go back. Jesus says, yeah, dude, you got to go back, or God. No, I don't want to go back. No, you got to go back.
Yeah. Right. It is like that.
Yeah. So you kind of touched on this sort of thing that I want to get into, which is, so folks, the point of all this, one of the main points is that James has what, an earlier version of the DSM would have called a substance-induced psychosis recurrent, meaning the symptoms come back in the absence of the drugs. And it comes back through emotional, psychological stressors. And the point here is, here's a guy who, did step work, and I'm not saying this is for everybody, but this is a case of somebody doing that and becoming completely asymptomatic. Actual psychospiritual healing in my opinion, of the first order. So it does happen. Happens quite a bit.
Right.
So the thing that James was just alluding to is that, he's a researcher and we share this, and we both got lost or probably arguably still lost in this, studying all this stuff around AA and the Oxford Group, and we'll discover Tom Powers, and we read William James, and we find out all the stuff that the pioneers were into, and yada, yada, yada. And, people often hear me say this, I fault the recovery community for not doing that research. However, you do that kind of research and it leaves you changed. And so I think what you and I have done more personally than any other way is that we've sort of deconstructed the 12 steps, the 12-step movement.
Okay.
In light of our experience, in light of our research.
Right.
Is that fair?
I guess it depends how you mean deconstructed.
Well, I mean, you go into meetings around the country, or you listen to tapes, or you even read some stuff, and then you've got all your own experience and all this research, and then it's not, you're interpreting it. The way I interpret it's, constantly changing. It's changed a lot. So what kind of changes did all that research, I mean, how do you see your experience now in light of all that?
Wow. So
it's a big ass question.
There's like a couple like nested questions in there.
Yeah.
First, let me just say, like, why did I start reading stuff? And see where that gets us. One is like, I remember the first time when I got to step 11, you took me to the library and found Varieties of Religious Experience and handed it to me and said, check this out and read it. And that set off a whole chain of like, all right, there's these books out there that talk about this stuff. And they're outside of AA, and they're, this is a thing that happens to people. that don't even work steps. It's just like spontaneously sometimes happens to people. And so there's all these other traditions and people talking about it, and we can explore, right? It opened up the world of like exploring stuff. The other thing was, I think it was Mike Bro that brought in Gresham's Law and AA into a meeting one night, and we read it. And if you haven't read that, people watching at home, it is basically a treatment of the history of AA that tries to explain why there are meetings where people are not working steps and getting better, right? Why are there meetings where people are just sort of showing up and being miserable, sharing their misery together, and then coming back the next week, instead of people like actively working these steps and having some kind of experience, right? And that really sparked an interest in me in like, okay, because that was a question. Like once the first, there's a lot of things that happen when you have that kind of experience that like we did with step 3. If you have some kind of a spark of awakening, then you go, where did that come from? How did that happen? It doesn't seem to be the direct result of the things that I did, and yet the things that I did gave rise to it, right? And there's a history to the things that I did. They came from somewhere. There's other people who have had this experience through this work or something like it, and so we follow our chain back to the Oxford group, and then into the traditions, different traditions of Christian mysticism or whatever, right? Spiritual experience. And so looking into Oxford group and then more broadly at different spiritual experiences and traditions around that was like, I mean, the value of that was like, we're not alone. We're not just this weird little group in the basement in the Maine woods. We're like, yeah, right. But like, this is a common feature of humanity, and people talk about it all the time. And it's like, it appears in all kinds of religions and cultures. And I feel connected to something bigger than me in a different way, right? And I can contextualize my experience and in ways that I think were useful to me as I was going along the business of trying to live as if that experience, which is now behind me, were still true, right? Like now that I'm not I'm acceptance all the time. Now that I'm like in the world, right? How do I approximate that kind of acceptance in the tasks of my daily life? Oh, well, here's this thing out of some Buddhist scripture that says this. I'm like, oh, that really resonates with me in how I'm trying to handle this relationship or whatever. So it felt like there was all this wisdom from people who had walked this or similar paths throughout time that was like, useful and made me think differently about it, but also made me feel like I could apply it in ways that I didn't know how to before. I mean, like in some way, in like a crass way, it's just like something different to talk about in the meeting, right?
Yeah.
You tell your own same story 100 million times, and then like.
Well, I mean, there's also the joy of like, reading something out of Merton and going, oh yeah, I experienced that.
Right.
That really, not only is that reassuring, but it makes you respect your own experience that much more.
Yeah. Oh, it is true.
Yeah.
It did happen to me, and it is real.
Right. It's been validated again and again.
Right.
I guess, so for me, the dissonance really started with this, and it actually led to me and Mikey having this thing for quite a while.
Huh.
And there were these people that we kept encountering who, were interested in what we were doing and attracted to what we're doing. And they started doing it with us, and it would just end poorly.
Mm. They would take steps and it would go.
Sometimes they'd get some relief, but then they would start engaging in like really destructive behaviors that just made your jaw drop, like not even getting high, just other stuff.
Right.
Or they simply weren't getting the effect of doing it, weren't really getting relief. And so there's this part of the book, and so this is where this weird dissonance started, where Bill says, there are people who cannot and will not. And I'm almost ashamed to admit this because I immediately run to, well, that phenomena we see right there are the cannots.
Sure. They'll never get it.
Was that?
They're not capable of getting it.
Yeah, and they're not capable of being honest with themselves. And, I knew enough about psychology then that maybe this is some kind of personality disorder, psychopathy. And that I stayed there for a little bit. And, there's certainly, I think I ran across people for whom that analysis probably applies.
Yeah, I met that guy.
Yeah. I met a few like him. But then this started happening. It took me a while to get there. And I started thinking, wait a minute, if somebody approaches this and it doesn't work for any reason, then saying things like they didn't want it enough, or they weren't ready yet, or they left something out of the fourth step. Now, this evolution I'm talking about wasn't right away. I've only grown into this over time. Yeah. But in effect, what you're doing is you're blaming the victim. You're saying it's your fault that you're not getting better.
Right.
And so the seed of that started really disturbing me. And it sort of lived with me for years. It troubled me for years. And I could say, yeah, there are some people that aren't ready, and there are some people who, are psychopathic or whatever. But then there are these other people who, whatever reason, this is just not going to work. It doesn't work. It's not meant to be.
It's not their way or something.
Yeah. And so the reasons why that might be, and this and that, that answering that question has kept me going for quite a while. And that kind of does lead us all the way to resistance recovery.
Right.
So, some of the things that I'm more confident about now, well, there's a couple ways of looking at this. One is, I don't think this is sort of deconstructing the 12 steps. I don't think the 12 steps treat trauma.
Right. Okay. Yeah, right.
So I think I think when people write about trauma in a fourth step, and a thing we make sure they do in the fourth column is not, don't own it around the victimization. What did you do with it post that? You knew you were in a bad neighborhood, or you preferred drugs to your own safety, or whatever your thing is.
Sure.
That affords a measure of insight, which can be very valuable, but I do not believe that it's healing.
I guess I would.
There are people that have had, if you got brutalized, savaged in the alley trying to buy the drugs, your body still carries.
Right. Okay. Right.
Your nervous system still carries the damage, the PTSD, if you will, of that.
Right.
I mean, that's just one example. And then if you start looking at people that have had, trauma histories, then questions of personal accountability and responsibility become very, they're different. Right. They're not the same for those people.
Right. I guess I would want to nuance that a little bit. Maybe I'm getting too deep into the weeds. Let me know. But I see pieces of people's traumatic experience, or like layers of it that get relief, and other layers that are persistent. Like this, somebody's, I don't want to say anybody, but I've seen people, recover from childhood sexual abuse, and they write some kind of piece of inventory that changes their understanding and relationship to the perpetrator, and they come to some kind of place like, I can understand, but I'll never trust that person because they're not trustworthy. But I'm in relationship to that history of abuse and my own experience of it, and to that human being, that there's all this, like, what I would call forgiveness, but it's just release of that resentment, and all the tension around that goes away.
Yeah, I've seen that too.
there's this big relief. And that doesn't mean that there aren't still lingering effects from that history that could be like PTSD symptoms or whatever else that I think.
Well, that's taking us back to, it doesn't heal that. So
right. But there's like two elements of that history that are the problem. One is the stuff that I'm still doing to myself about it.
That's true.
And then there's the embodied experience of it.
That's that, and there's my point. So the experiences, I'll use myself as an example. I finally came to realize that the extent of my trauma, I meet criteria for PTSD. I have a startle response. I have a narrow emotional range. I have real issues with trust that only seem to have gotten worse as I've aged.
Yeah.
So, and that's my point.
Right.
So deconstructing the steps, what we're seeing is it does not do anything with the body.
Right.
As such, one of the dangers of it is it's a disembodied, it tends towards disembodiment.
Okay.
And not entirely, but just hear me out. So, I have whatever modern American life that, dislocated life. This is another piece of this whole new way of thinking.
Yep.
And I experienced some trauma or stress, I think even chronic stress. So I'm just not happy. And I try to regulate my affect by going into my brain. We know people, trauma and stress do this. You try to manage these unmanageable feelings by thinking about them. And for some of us, we go up there and that is not a cool place to be. This wasn't a cool place to be. This is not a cool place to be. So we high, right?
Right.
And we get relief. Mm-hmm. But you see, now you're even disembodying further. And it varies with the drugs you take, but generally speaking. Right. So then you, out of desperation, come into recovery or some spiritual modality. This is another strange thing. And we seek healing there. So sometimes this is 12 steps, but it could be yoga, it could be psychedelics, it could be somatic therapies, it could be Buddhist meditation. And we get relief. But here's the thing that seems really, really perilous. If this stuff in the body is still bad enough or powerful enough, your spirituality can become a constant quest. In the sense you're still disembodied. It's reading the books, going to the churches. It becomes this kind of spirituality.
Yeah.
Talking, currency of spiritual ideas in lieu of spirituality. Because when we think about that thing that we had for that period of time, that blissful state, that was fully present and embodied.
Yes, right.
It was whole that way.
Right. That's the kind of thing that a bumblebee on the forehead brings you back to. Not the kind of thing that reading some treatise on, treatise on,
or notice something in the big book that you've never seen before.
Right. It's a very different state than that.
Yeah. And so what I've seen, so I do see people like you described, but I also see people who have trauma histories and they come into AA and God's will and accountability and your part in it, and they can't even begin to get traction. Right. The door is slammed shut out the gate. Mm-hmm. And then when you start kind of looking at the demographics, then it looks to be a correlation. Mm-hmm. Less women, less poor people, less minorities.
Oh, sure. Right. Because there's more trauma in those the underrepresented areas of AA.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's just this sort of one piece of deconstruction. So what I said earlier about the map and the territory, I wish I could remember dude's name, so I owe him an apology. But there's this guy who wrote this book. He writes books, good writer. And I heard him on a podcast, and he said, they got into this, and I'm kind of taking liberties with it, my own take. But he said, remember, all of these things are about enchantment. He's talking about spiritual experiences, these enchanted states, which have an affective quality. Mm-hmm. Things are, beautiful, or they're deep, they're rich, they're dripping with meaning. There's all of that. It's aesthetic, really, right? And he says literalism, cynicism, skepticism, fear, those things just cause enchantment can't withstand the presence of those things. But then they get in this conversation about maps versus territories. So if we said recovery is a territory, or maybe it's not recovery, addiction, let's say addiction is a territory, sure. And the 12 steps are a map, right? You really think about it, the 12 steps, if you start unpacking them, they're not only they're a map, they're a human anthropology. They're making strong claims about what the human being is. There's an implied cosmology. There's a prescriptive path. There's an orthopraxis. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a literal document that, no matter how you interpret it, it's got the same number of pages and all that. Right. And what I did, I don't know if he said this or not, but if we're in a community where we all really start buying into the map, like really buy into the map, then the enchantment can kind of feed off each other. I'm not saying there's a truth to the map. Okay. But I'm saying we start seeing red threads through our experiences, and so we gather together and some juice is flowing. And
yeah. Because that buy into the map sort of holds at bay that skepticism and cynicism and etc.
Fear.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
And I think you and I also know the difference between the literalist with the big book and the artist with the big book. And so we buy into that, and the enchantment and the truth of it, because there's truth in it, is really powerful. It just, it can cause this, it's generative. Mm-hmm. But then there's the territory. And the territory is, not only people with trauma, or minorities. The territory is also, the person who can get Buddhism, but they can't really get any kind of narrative that talks about sin. Right. Selfishness, you can do all these clever things to bring them together, but it's you know what I mean? And so you read somebody like James Hillman or this George Farrar guy, and they make this very interesting point. They say there are spiritual experiences available to James that aren't available to Tom.
Oh, that's interesting. Because they would say the spiritual experience isn't just like the cultural context that I can accept it in is not just a window dressing. It's part of the thing itself.
It's part of the thing itself, but also even more, you could even make it more individual. Like some people have better eyesight, some people have better hearing.
Okay.
And some people are tone deaf to anything evangelical.
Right.
They just can't hear it. They just can't hear it. Whereas somebody else can drop into mindfulness. Mm-hmm. The way they're built, I can't drop into mindfulness.
Right.
So the territory is littered. See, so I guess what I'm saying is that you and I have spiritual experiences based on the kind of beings we are as individuals, and your context, you're right, the context we're in. And those experiences aren't available to other people.
Right.
Furthermore, they have experiences that aren't available to us.
Right.
But then when we get together and we all buy the map at least a lot of us are having kind of a family resemblance experience. Our third step sounds similar, but they're still not identical.
Right.
There's a family resemblance, they're recognizable as such.
Right.
Yeah. And so I think that I just think that we need to attend to the territory.
So let me take us a step back from this, because we've gone way into the territory here.
Yeah.
The first kind of shocking thing that we made in this set of the conversation is to say that the steps don't work for everything, right? So by deconstructing the steps, what you meant is like to see its limitations and to see those limitations in a broader context, right?
Or contexts.
Right. So that's going to be hard for a lot of people to hear, this idea that the steps don't work for everything. I remember at one point, like an asshole, I asked you if you were writing inventory, and you said the inventory doesn't work for everything. And I thought you lost your fucking mind. And it's only much later that I've seen things in myself and in other areas of life where I'm like, oh yeah, well, inventory is not like the Swiss Army knife of spirituality that does all things, right?
Yeah.
It has a limited set of range of things that it can do, and expecting it to do more than that is to misunderstand it and even abuse it. But you and I both started in a place where, yes, the map is the territory. This is the way to do it. We might be having variations, but it's the same thing, and anybody can have it. They're just being resistant idiots, and they need to get this thing. And we went out and we said, get it. We went out to other meetings to tell them that this is the way, and, you know.
Reformers.
Yeah, right. Not everybody liked that. But
No. We can say it was mixed results. We can't say that it was
right.
It was mixed results.
For me, that it was something that caught my attention and they got a lot of buy-in and got me a recovery.
Yep.
Because, oh, this is different. Oh, that's the message. Oh, wow, I can have this thing, right? If it didn't stand out, I wouldn't have got it. So what we're talking about now is a long distance from the 12 steps are the thing, they're the only thing you need. Oh, that was the other thing, is like throughout this growth, there's a sense of like, well, these tools, the spiritual toolkit solves my problem with, being a crazy man. They should be able to solve my problem with being frustrated in my love life, or, being worried about finding a job. And they often do that, but they don't always, right? There's a sense of like returning to those tools again and again and expecting a particular kind of them making me feel better, instead of really, using them as an opportunity to see something about myself that I couldn't otherwise.
Or recognizing that it's just not the tool for the job.
It's not the tool for the job.
Or it's not up to the job.
Right. So yeah, that's a big deal in itself, right? I think some people will be threatened by that statement.
Probably not this audience so much.
Right.
So,
okay.
If I were to characterize the 12 steppers in this audience, and they're only a percentage,
right?
Many of them had very powerful experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And they are at a place now, though, you basically just described it.
Right.
Yeah, they're sensing that there has to be some kind of growth or shift in perspective or more inclusive or something. There are other people here who, and so some of those people, are the psychedelic crowd.
Mm-hmm.
Some of those people are the trauma crowd.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are a lot of people here, I've certainly interviewed one who they really, they've had and seen such bad stuff or had such negative experiences with steps that they never they never got a foothold. But they want to have a recovery community, and so they're kind of attracted to the dislocation theory or to the activism.
Right.
So it's a very interesting audience that way.
Cool.
Yeah.
I would have been threatened by this message, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It would have kind of spooked me because all I had was these steps and these practices and, run them into the ground. If I write it, the inventory 15 times, eventually I'll change my behavior or something, right?
You get sick of yourself.
Yeah, right. But that's kind of like a self-flagellation thing that's not going to pan out very well, really, in all cases. So, all right. So I just was checking with that to see like how big of a bomb we were dropping on people to say that the steps have limitations, right?
Yeah.
Right. Bill Wilson called them a spiritual kindergarten, and I used to think that was because he didn't know how to use them properly. Right.
Me too.
Yeah. Right.
He didn't know. He didn't know the voltage of his own weapon.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, but what do you do with that then? You got steps that do something pretty good, pretty strongly in some cases, not in all cases. For a certain kind of people who approach it a certain kind of way, it can have a life-transforming thing. But most people who have addiction are not going to be able to get that for one reason or another, either through trauma or life history or cultural preference situation, or just like they don't get it because now most exposure to the steps is couched in meeting attendance stuff. So they can't be the thing that gives everybody a spiritual awakening.
Nope.
And then we're faced with, where do we go from there?
Well, we're faced with a massive problem that seems to be is getting worse. Since the quarantine, overdoses have gone up 42%.
Mm.
That's staggering. That's huge numbers.
Right.
I mean, I appreciate your point about not being threatened by this, although I wonder about that. I wonder about had we had a different context, might we not see it differently? I mean, so I don't think the steps are the only game in town.
Right.
So like the perennially controversial topic of psychedelics on RR, and I post articles that are both pro and con, or critical anyway. There are people who said they can only break through in the steps with that. So they're steps and that. There are other people that had fairly weak step experiences and went the psychedelic route and felt that it took them much closer to their old drug addicted ways, so they back off.
Sure. Right.
But what I think is certainly undeniable is that there are some people on there for whom it's true.
Sure.
That it was, yeah. Then there's some of the trauma folks, and they tend to be women, and they're, hey, I want to say goodbye to Jessica.
Yeah, go for it.
Bye.
Bye, Jess.
Love you, bye.
I love you. And so they're finding their way into modalities that are going to do for them what the steps didn't. So, I think we're getting to a place where we're more sophisticated and we're not saying either or anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that what is getting highlighted is the things that don't work pretty much across the board and are egregiously exploitative of addicts. So there's family resemblance between the steps and the Buddhism and the trauma stuff and all this and that, and that can give us a different way of talking about this. And I think dislocation theory actually speaks more to that, because if we were to put that those few months we had as sort of like the once and done integrated state or whatever.
Yeah.
You're seeing something about you're not in the stress response. There's no urgency to go or be somebody that you're not.
Mm-hmm.
The tenor of your relationships is very good. You're receptive, you're responsive to other people. And, so that's all speaking to what Alexander would call integration. And he's saying that, historically that's been a human phenomenon, and it can be more of a cultural phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
Cultures can be, see, here's the other thing. We're at a point now where we are so dislocated. We have this really strong association between spirituality and trauma. The two are practically dance partners for us, right? So it's like when James writes, remember reading Once Born and Twice Born?
Yeah.
I can remember thinking, well, who the fuck are these once born people? I don't know. I didn't even know what he's talking about, really. Right? To me, the only way to get a spiritual footing is through alcoholism and divorce and combat and cancer and all this. But what James is pointing to is very much what Alexander's talking about. He's saying there have been these cultures, most, if probably, where, you don't have a word for religion. Mm-hmm. Chopping wood and hunting and making love and it's all spiritual.
Right.
And you have shared spiritual values, and there's a place for everybody throughout the life cycle, children to the very old. The worst thing they could do to you is shun you. And so those are the once born people. They're born into a spiritual thing that works for them. It gives them an identity, a communal identity, an individual identity. They live out their years. It's inherently conservative in the sense of conserving, right? Rooted in tradition and all that. And that has become increasingly, it's disappearing. And it's most disappeared here. So we don't get much nourishment from our neighbors. We don't know who our neighbors are. We're afraid of our neighbors.
Right. We'd rather
don't know who our great grandparents were. Marriage and parenting and friendship is all getting harder.
Yeah.
So spirituality is like, whoa, spirituality is going to heal this. Well, yeah, there's truth to that, but we're taking this way that you and I live as some sort of baseline, some sort of normative thing, and it's not.
Right.
And that's why we became addicts. In those cultures, they don't have addiction.
Right. But it puts us in a difficult spot, which is we catch a recovery. We have our moment in the sun of feeling integrated and connected to everything. And then, slowly pulling ourselves back into this disintegrated society and living life, as I say, like you're just going on with the business of living, and it's with all its problems. And I may go off on a tangent here, so pull me back in if you need to. But the early chapter 2 meeting that we were a part of was mistaking the map for the territory, as you say. It was saying like this book and these steps and that's the thing. And it did do that magic trick that you were talking about of reminding me of the feeling of that couple months. When we were doing that with the book, when we were reading the book and then talking about our experiences with it, and then connecting with someone in the room who either didn't believe it or was really wanting it, or there was some kind of energy there, then that thing would like wake back up inside me, right? Not in the same form, but it would be this like, there would be a connection there, like a purpose.
Enchantment.
Yeah, it would happen in that room, right? And we were inviting people into it, and sometimes it took. But all the little groups like that I've seen have fallen apart.
And what Alexander would say, it's because the pressures outside of that building are too great.
Right.
He would say that that works because it integrates you.
Right.
That's why spiritual modalities work. But he would say the problem is the world you leave, the world you go into after the meeting or after the yoga retreat or after the ayahuasca session, whatever, is increasingly dislocated.
Right.
So these kids now, they're swimming in waters that were way worse than the ones we were swimming in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so the really the looming problem is how, it's not a matter of like, it's not a conservative move in that we have to go back to the 1950s or anything, but it's a move that how do you rebuild community consciously? So what are those elements?
Right.
And I don't think you're going to come up with 10-step inventory. I think what you're going to come up with is communities of people getting out of the stress response through somatic means, being inclusive. We were right about that at chapter 2, being broadly inclusive of the people that aren't like us.
Right.
But also having an activism, or if you will, 12th step that extends far beyond taking somebody through the big one.
Right.
Because it's trying to foster integration
broadly
wherever you're in the world.
Right. By volunteering at the pet shelter and by serving food to the homeless, by whatever
I even think it gets more radical than that, like having a conversation.
Right.
I think that's actually subversive at this point.
Right. Just talking to somebody about what you really think and feel.
Yeah, or two of you reading an article and talking about it. I mean, that's
being vulnerable.
Right. Being vulnerable.
Being vulnerable with somebody and taking the risk that'll pan out.
Very hard to be vulnerable when you're scared. Very hard to be vulnerable when you're impossible. Right. When you're stressed or traumatized.
Right. Right.
I mean, I think to answer your question, I think there's an outline and a place to go in dialogue and practice and experimentation. I mean, I think it's all there. Yeah. And that's kind of what resistance recovery is about in a way, is let's hear from these voices that aren't yours.
Right. So this is like, maybe this isn't the question that would come up from the people that are already down with resistance recovery, but I can, putting my big book guy hat on, I can imagine people having a certain, resistance to this idea, because it's like, well, I can't fix the whole world. You're telling me the world is broken, and that's why I'm having trouble. I don't have any control over that, so I should just stay here and focus on my little me, right? And what you're saying is like, it's not that simple, right?
I'm saying that's not even viable.
That's not even viable, right? Okay. The 12. So this is a piece. I'm trying to get us to a place of deconstructing a different element of 12-step culture, which is this piece of, I work my steps, I have my God, I do my inventory, I keep my side of the street clean, we don't talk politics in meetings. The best thing for the new guy is not to tell him that the world's fucking him over. It's to tell him he needs to take responsibility for himself, right? Sure. So there's that's sort of like an ethos inside of AA and 12 steps, that this is now saying, this is deconstructing that.
Right.
And saying, no, we need something different than that. But it's I don't know how to articulate that difference very well, other than to say, well, we consider things more broadly or something goofy like that. But it's not like, I don't know, like if I've got a new guy, a guy who wants to get sober and he's asking me for help. I don't know how to boil down the resistance recovery message into like, the 30-second soundbite of here's what you need to know right now. I do know how to do it.
I don't know if it's even, I don't know if that's, what I've been doing, I did for the last 4 years is I took dislocation theory and I operationalized it as a treatment tool.
Yeah.
I contextualized it. So, you can, and I've done it, you can really show that the etiology of addiction is, in the environment, and that rid is dislocation and spirituality is integration.
Yep.
And you can show how there's also individual sin. There's definitely something wrong with human nature. But you can also show how societies, when they get really sick, they reward and encourage the very worst things about ourselves.
Right.
Namely, greed, competition, and avarice.
Right.
And I have found that this isn't confusing, that this actually, they get charged over that.
Do they get charged? So like, does it run counter though to this, to the value of the fourth column? Do you know what I mean? Like this value of like owning it versus like.
No, it doesn't, because you still have to own your shit.
Yeah.
That
can be hard to parse, I feel like, right? Like,
it can be, but it's not as hard as you might think. So, because otherwise you're left with this narrative. I had a good family. My parents loved me. I was upper middle class. My parents were college educated. It was always assumed that I was going to go to college. But I'm such a selfish prick that I abused all that. And this is where I wound up. You see, what you're doing with that narrative is you're taking that addict, you're saying that addict is pathologically and abnormally different. Mm-hmm. And you are saying, you're giving a very Bill Wilson, AA, I would say, not NA, message that there is a normal world out there and you are maladjusted to it. Come with me and do these steps, and you too can have the mortgage and the wife and the kids. Right. You take that message into a prison and they're like, fuck you, in a way. Mm-hmm. Because what they're hearing is you're saying, you basically effaced multi-generational poverty. You effaced your parents' and grandparents' alcoholism. You effaced the childhood sexual abuse. You effaced the combat.
Right.
You've made all that normative. So, I have a lot of clients these last 4 years that are young men who are, completely apathetic. And I wouldn't say depressed, I would say apathetic. And what I mean by that is they have no giddy up, they have no passion. They've lived lives on psychiatric medication, digital devices. They're losing social intelligence. They don't make eye contact. They don't attend to the tone of voice. They don't shake hands firmly. And it looks to me with some of them, your only chance is to talk to them about the effects of Adderall and the effects of digital addiction and porn addiction. You need to speak directly to their experience of how they got that way. And then they might become a little interested in recovery.
All right. So if
like, you come at them with a big book too heavily, they're like, what the fuck is this?
Right. Okay. So to my point of like, what do you tell the new guy in the first 30 seconds? It's like a totally different spiel. It's like, instead of saying like, you need God, you need other addicts, and you need the truth, that's a formulation from Tom Powers, which I think is great, right? Like the first thing you need to know is like, This is the stuff that's going to sustain
What
you.
you said, I'm worried that we're going to run out of time in 5 minutes. So if we do, we.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, you want to just go into
No,
rapid
let's
mode?
keep going for a second though. Power said God and what were the truth and what?
So Tom Powers has this little thing called like what to hang on to.
Right.
And it's like 3 things, and it's basically like the piece that you would tell someone if they're brand new and you've got just a minute, 3 minutes maybe to tell them what they need to do. And
Right.
Hang on to God. So some kind of spirituality, but you better get that and hang tight because you can't do this yourself. Hang on to others. You're going to need the fellowship. You're going to need other people like you. You need to integrate into something, and hang on to the truth. Like you got to stop lying and get rid of all that. And
See, what I would do with that is I would start with truth.
Uh-huh.
And so that's why, I think, at the heart of what I'm getting at is the truth of the addiction has to do with, the effects of globalization on America. The truth of the condition has to do with the lie that there's a chemical imbalance. The truth has to do with the explosion in drug addiction had to do with the prescription of illicit drugs to people who weren't addicts initially. All that is the truth. And then there's the more personal truth of what your behavior is doing to your loved ones. And are you going to run from that, or are you going to have an empathic moment?
Right.
See, I'm about,
You still got to own your shit inside of the mess that is the modern world.
You don't have any choice.
But somehow talking about the mess is an entrance to that.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Yeah.
So I feel like we I set for 2 hours, and we've used most of that, but we had to start later and all that. Mm-hmm. So I don't feel like we've gotten. It's a good conversation. So
I don't know where we're going, but yeah.
Yeah, we got places to go. So let's do a round 2 in a few weeks. Does that sound good?
Sure, yeah, it's cool.
Yeah.
It's always nice to chat.
Yeah, no, I think people are going to be very, very interested in this. So,
cool.
And just for the record, resistance recovery, it's a named thing, and there's some ideas floating around, and I'm going to eventually, kind of codify it a little bit, but. That's what
I like it. And I'm asking these questions as like I'm sort of a devil's advocate position, but I really dig it. And in a way, I feel like the way that chapter 2 Thursday night's critique of the rest of AA woke me up and made me pay attention. This kind of critique of larger social situations or whatever can have that same kind of like, oh, I'm paying attention now, right? Because you're seeing the thing that I'm living on this broader scale, and then, right?
Yeah.
I've been to all these meetings, they were crappy. You're telling me meetings are crappy, but this is different. Oh, right? I've been living this life in this society. You're telling me why that's all fucked up. I know it's fucked up.
Right.
So now we have something in common, and I'm paying attention, right?
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because that is my experience, and it is the experience of my clients.
Yeah, right.
And in fact, I think, push come to shove, I would say a higher percentage of them feel this than they do the big book at this point.
Yeah, big book's old school, man.
Yeah, we're old school.
Time for something new.
All right, James, thank you so much. Do you want to, before we say goodbye, do you want to plug the game?
Oh, yeah, I also write board games. If you're interested, I wrote this really long, like branching narrative board game called Role Player Adventures.
Role Player Adventures.
Role Player Adventures. You can find it on the internet. It's got like 2 days left on Kickstarter. I don't know when this will air, but it'll probably be done by the time this goes up. But it's still out there to be found if you're curious. Yeah, there it is. I don't want to sell it too hard, but it's a weird, like, other part of my life, the sort of imaginary creative writing aspect that it's like, for me, it's connected, but I don't know if it's topically.
Hey, resistance recovery is going to be all about weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Talk soon.